That instant coffee you're sipping on right now? It's a blend of beans from up to 50 different countries. And guess what? It's even been to space. NASA astronauts have been drinking instant coffee since the 1960s. This magical powder has traveled far and wide, but what makes it so irresistible? You might think it's a quick, simple process. It's instant coffee at the end of the day, but the truth, it's anything but simple. This is the making of rich, bold, and irresistibly smooth instant coffee. Before we dive into the crazy science behind turning coffee into those magical little instant granules, we need to talk about where it all begins, the coffee bean itself. And no, coffee isn't actually a bean. It's a seed that comes from a bright red fruit called a coffee cherry. Yep, so you're just addicted to fruits, not caffeine. Take that, doc. Your morning dose of caffeine fix comes from a tiny fruit that looks like a cherry but tastes absolutely nothing like one. If your coffee had a passport, it would have stamps from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. These regions sit in the coffee belt, an area near the equator where coffee plants thrive in warm, tropical climates. The best beans usually come from countries like Brazil, Colombia, Ethiopia, and Vietnam. But how long does it take for a coffee plant to grow? Patience is key here. A coffee plant takes around 3 to 4 years before it starts producing cherries. That means farmers have to wait almost 4 years before they even get their first proper harvest. But they get to reap the benefits for quite some time. A single coffee tree can live for 50 to 100 years. That means some trees out there have been growing beans since the time your great-grandparents were sipping on their morning brews. The coffee cherries are finally ripe and ready to be picked. But here's where things get interesting. Not all coffee is harvested the same way. If you're drinking high-quality Arabica coffee, there's a good chance those cherries were picked by hand. Workers only pick the ripest, reddest cherries, leaving the unripe ones behind. They have to go back to the same trees multiple times, since cherries don't ripen all at once. It's slow, but it ensures only the best cherries make it into your cup. Picking coffee cherries by hand is basically like playing a real-life game of spot the difference, except your paycheck depends on how well you do. For big coffee farms, especially those growing Robusta beans, waiting around to hand-pick cherries isn't exactly practical. That's where big harvesting machines come in. These machines shake the coffee trees, causing cherries to fall into collection bins. It's much faster than hand-picking, but there's a downside: ripe and unripe cherries get mixed together. That's why Robusta coffee tends to have a stronger, less refined taste compared to Arabica. A single mechanical harvester can pick as much coffee in one day as 50 people picking by hand. Now that we have a bunch of coffee cherries, how do we get the actual coffee bean out of them? Well, that's where things start to get messy. Literally. Because inside every coffee cherry is a sticky, slimy mess that we need to clean up. Imagine trying to peel a cherry, but doing it thousands of times in a single minute. That's what happens during depulping, where machines remove the outer skin of the coffee cherry to expose the inner bean. The cherries are dumped into a pulping machine, which uses rollers or blades to squeeze out the seeds. The red skin and some pulp get removed, leaving behind slimy, sticky beans covered in a layer of mucilage, which is basically plant slime. The outer fruit is usually composted or used as fertilizer for the next batch of coffee plants. In some places, the discarded coffee fruit is used to make a tea called cascara. It's fruity, slightly caffeinated, and tastes nothing like coffee. Now we've got these mucilage-covered beans, but they're still too sticky to process. That's where fermentation comes in, a natural process that helps break down the slime. The beans are soaked in giant tanks of water for 12 to 48 hours. Natural enzymes and bacteria eat away the sticky mucilage, cleaning up the beans. The longer the fermentation, the more the flavor profile develops. Once the fermentation is done, the beans are rinsed with fresh water to wash away any leftover residue. What's left behind is a smooth, clean coffee bean, ready for the next step. Some specialty coffee brands use honey processing, where they leave a little bit of mucilage on the beans to create a sweeter, fruitier flavor. After we've got our clean, wet coffee beans, it's time to dry them out completely. This is one of the most important steps in coffee production. Too much moisture, and the beans will rot. Too little, and they lose flavor. There are two ways to dry coffee beans. First is the sun drying, which is a traditional method where farmers spread the beans out on giant patios or raised beds. They have to rake them every few hours to make sure they dry evenly. This method takes weeks, but many experts believe it results in a better tasting coffee. Then we have machine drying, where large factories use hot air dryers to speed up the process. The beans are placed in rotating drums that dry them evenly. This method is much faster, but can sometimes reduce the complexity of flavors. The ideal moisture content for a dried coffee bean is 10 to 12%. Any more, and the beans could grow mold. Any less, and they'll taste flat and lifeless. The coffee beans we have are still green and flavorless, so how do we turn them into the aromatic, roasted beans we all know and love? Well, it's time to fire things up. But before we turn these into that delicious Nescafé instant coffee, they need to go on a worldwide journey through factories, machines, and expert tasters. Once the beans are dried, they can't just sit around in any old warehouse. They need to be stored in cool, dry, and well-ventilated conditions to keep their quality intact. They're packed into jute bags or massive bulk containers for shipping. These beans travel thousands of miles to reach Nescafé factories around the world. By the time these beans reach their destination, they're months old but still fresh, just waiting for their transformation into coffee magic. Some specialty coffee beans are stored in wooden barrels, just like whiskey, to absorb unique flavors. Now, before we roast these beans, we need to make sure there's nothing weird mixed in, because, well, farms are outdoors and nature is messy. So the beans go through a serious deep cleaning process. They pass through giant sifters that remove broken beans, dirt, and debris. Robotic arms and lasers scan for any foreign objects. Yep, even coffee factories use freaking lasers. And defective beans are immediately discarded. Only the best and healthiest beans make it past this round. Some high-end coffee factories use color sorting machines that scan each bean and reject the ones that aren't the perfect shade of green. Now comes the part where humans step in, because no matter how fancy the machines are, only trained coffee tasters, called Q-graders, can truly judge the quality. This is where cupping happens, a fancy term for coffee taste testing. Beans are lightly roasted, ground, and brewed into small cups. The experts sniff, swirl, and slurp to evaluate flavor, acidity, aroma, and body. And yes, they slurp loudly, because aerating the coffee helps them taste all the subtle flavors. If a batch passes the test, it moves on to the roasting process. If not, it's out. A professional coffee taster might sample hundreds of cups a day, but they don't actually drink them. They spit them out like wine tasters. After all the cleaning, sorting, and taste testing, our beans still don't smell or taste like coffee. Right now, they're just hard little green nuggets of disappointment. So how do we bring out that rich, aromatic, soul-waking coffee flavor? We roast them. And this is where the real transformation happens. Roasting coffee doesn't just turn these green beans brown. What actually happens is a precise chemical transformation that creates the flavors and aromas we love. First, the beans absorb heat and turn yellow, smelling a bit like popcorn at first. As the temperature rises, moisture evaporates and the beans start expanding like tiny popcorn kernels. The famous first crack happens. This is when the beans literally pop as gases and oils escape. If you've ever heard coffee beans cracking while roasting, congrats, you've witnessed a chemical reaction in action. Depending on how long they roast, the flavor changes dramatically. And here's where we get to the roast levels. Every coffee roast has a different flavor profile. Let's look at the light roast first. Some people like their coffee light and fruity, while others prefer it bold and smoky. This type is roasted for the shortest time at the lowest temperature, preserves the bean's natural acidity and floral flavors. It tastes a bit like tea with citrusy notes, but not super bitter. It is often used in high-end specialty coffees, but not common for instant coffee. Most people like medium roast. It is roasted a bit longer for a balanced flavor. It's not too acidic, not too bitter. It has a slightly caramelized, nutty taste with some acidity. This is what most instant coffee is made from. And lastly, we've got the bold people who love the dark roast. It is roasted the longest at high temperatures, up to 240 degrees Celsius. It has a deep, smoky, bitter taste with almost no acidity. It is used for strong coffees like espresso and sometimes instant coffee blends. The longer the roast, the less caffeine the beans have. Yes, light roasts actually have more caffeine than dark roasts. Coffee beans are normally roasted at 180 to 240 degrees Celsius for about 10 to 15 minutes. The moment the beans hit the perfect color, aroma, and crack, they're rapidly cooled to stop the cooking process. If they roast for too long, they'll taste burnt and ashy. Even though roasted coffee smells amazing, if you bite into a roasted bean before grinding, it's still pretty bland and crunchy. The real magic happens only after grinding. We're so close to turning these roasted beans into that magical cup of coffee you can't live without. But before we start brewing, we need to grind those beans just right. Grinding is a crucial step and is the secret behind how much flavor gets pulled out of the beans. Coffee grounds need to be coarsely ground, so not as fine as the powder you'd use for espresso. If it's too fine, it can get too bitter. And if it's too coarse, you won't extract enough of the delicious flavor. It's all about finding that sweet spot. The grind size also affects how much coffee flavor gets into the water. A finer grind releases flavor quicker, while coarser grounds take a bit longer for the extraction process. So, when making instant coffee, we grind the beans to a size that'll give us the right amount of flavor without turning your cup into a bitter disaster. After grinding, it's time to extract that liquid gold. To make instant coffee, we can't just brew a regular cup. We need industrial-scale brewing machines. These machines use pressurized hot water. The hot water is forced through the coffee grounds at high pressure, extracting all those rich flavors and oils. This process results in a thick, concentrated coffee liquid. Now comes the fun part, turning that concentrated coffee liquid into the powder we all know and love. There are two ways to do this, and both have their pros and cons. First is spray drying. The concentrated coffee liquid is sprayed into hot air at around 200 degrees Celsius. The liquid is rapidly dried, turning into coffee powder almost instantly. This method is cheap and fast, which is why it's commonly used for instant coffee you find in stores. However, it tends to lose some of the delicate coffee flavors in the process. Spray-dried coffee loses more aroma compared to freeze-dried coffee, which is why some coffee snobs may turn their noses up at the cheaper versions. But hey, it's still coffee, right? Next, we have freeze-drying. This method starts with freezing the concentrated coffee at minus 50 degrees Celsius into slabs. These slabs are then broken into small granules and subjected to a process called sublimation, where the ice turns directly into vapor without going through the liquid stage. The result? Pure coffee granules that are more flavor-packed and aromatic than their spray-dried cousins. Freeze-dried coffee might cost a bit more, but it keeps more of the coffee's original flavor and aroma. making it the choice for premium instant coffee like Nescafe Gold. You get what you pay for, people. Now that we've got our precious coffee granules, how do we make sure they stay fresh and delicious until you rip open that sachet at 7 a.m., half asleep? Well, that's where smart packaging comes in. Once the coffee granules are ready, they are carefully measured and packed into airtight glass jars, tins, or single-use sachets. These containers are designed to lock in freshness and prevent the coffee from absorbing moisture, which could turn it into a sad, clumpy mess. But wait, there's a little science trick here. Some manufacturers, like Nescafe, flush the jars with nitrogen gas before sealing them. This prevents oxidation, which is the fancy way of saying it stops your coffee from going stale too soon. This is the same method used for packing chips, so no, that half-empty bag of chips isn't a scam, it's just science. If stored correctly, instant coffee can last 2 to 3 years, maybe even longer. But there are some golden rules. Keep it cool, sealed, and dry. Moisture is instant coffee's worst enemy. 1 drop of water and you've got a brick instead of powder. Your cup of Nescafe might be a blend of beans from over 50 different countries. Coffee beans are sourced from places like Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, and Ethiopia, then shipped to factories around the world for processing. Once packed, these little jars of magic travel across the planet to supermarkets, cafes, and even space missions. And let's not forget sustainability. Nestlé runs programs to support coffee farmers, promote ethical sourcing, and reduce environmental impact. Because, hey, coffee is great, but we also need a planet to grow it on. Instant coffee was actually invented to deal with a coffee surplus. Back in 1938, Nestlé scientists developed the first-ever commercial instant coffee after Brazil had a massive overproduction of coffee beans. They needed a way to preserve all that extra coffee, and that's how Nescafé was born. But what do you think? Do you prefer instant coffee or freshly brewed coffee? Or maybe, does coffee even taste the same once you know how it's made? Let us know in the comments. And if this got your adrenaline pumping, check out our video on KFC chicken buckets.